Very warm welcome to all of you. So many folks have traveled from far away to be with us today, and we're thrilled to have this group together. My name is Aishwarya. I work as the Deputy Director of the Economic Growth Center, and this project is both professionally, important because it's an important topic for the world, but also personally just a dear, dear subject, and it's just wonderful that we'll have a chance to dig into it today. Today is meant to be a bit of a generative session. The Gender and Growth Gaps workshop, like Rohini said, spans a couple of years. So please treat this as the starting point for raising questions, and hopefully in a year's time we'll come back and see where we're at in terms of moving them forward. So just a little bit of some information on the Economic Growth Center, because this institution might be less familiar to some of you. But it's one of the oldest research centers in the United States focused on quantitatively analyzing development processes. And so it was founded in 1961. And you will see, throughout this day, the EGC has a particular approach to thinking about development and growth. And it's thinking about, structural transformation processes, but in the context of both shocks, like climate change, but also in terms of distributional dynamics. We're very interested to see what happens with people in the center, at the margins, when you have these fairly significant changes happening in economies and societies. And I've put in here one of the sort of quotes from the founding of the EGC, and this goes a little bit to what Dean Sonobe said. Research-informed policy, policy-informed research. So it's very possible for academic research to be its own self-fulfilling pursuit, but we are very interested in having research that is useful to attacking some of the most grave problems in the world today. And hopefully this workshop is part of that engagement. So the Economic Growth Center actually owes part of its founding to Simon Kuznets, who is known for his seminal work on national accounting, thinking about GDP, thinking about growth, inequality very carefully. And some of the EGC's earliest programs were around thinking about national accounting, but for newly independent countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, but thinking about what it would take to build these, to think about structural transformation more systematically. And so this has long been our mission, and now we're looking at it in sort of the 21st century and seeing what does it mean to think about economies that are transforming, and who gets to participate, who gets to benefit, are there any changes needed? So one of the things that's possibly not as apparent from Kuznets' work is this sort of wonderful quote, which talks about the hidden costs and returns involved in the shift towards urban life, which might also apply to many other costs and returns involved in other shifts imposed by economic growth. And so this is the backdrop when we talk about structural transformation. It is a costly process. There are different costs, risks imposed on different members of a society as they participate in this transformation. And so today we have a chance to dig into this in a little more depth, thinking about South Asia today. So economic growth and structural transformation. When some of the earliest work on thinking about the gender dynamics of this change come from Esther Bostrup, of course, and then Claudia Golden sort of looking at the US in a lot more detail, but also looking cross-sectionally across countries. And this is kind of the founding, sort of our reference point of sorts, where some of the thinking around what happens as incomes increase, or if you look cross-sectionally at high-income countries versus low-income countries versus middle-income countries, what do you see in terms of gender dynamics of labor force participation? So this U-shaped hypothesis kind of originates there, and you see some kind of a pattern with low-income and high-income countries having higher levels of female labor force participation, with something of a lower level between those extremes. And so the hypothesis there, which many of you are very familiar with, is that there's something about the way work evolves and how it evolves alongside gendered dynamics in society, going from small family farms to more mechanized agriculture and more factory-based manufacturing, which has been the traditional structural transformation pathway. In that kind of transformation, it seems that there are fewer women who participate in the labor force because of a number of constraints and preferences, perhaps. And then when you move towards different kinds of job opportunities opening up in the economy with higher levels of income, you get to a more maybe service-led economy. You see a lot more women participating as well, and also as wages rise. But against that context, you have a lot of analyses that have taken place over the past many decades. One of them, Stefan Claassen, wonderful to sort of think through the variability and heterogeneity in experiences of different countries and regions. So there doesn't seem to be this very pat explanation for how gender gaps in labor markets evolve, but there's a lot more variability. So how do we understand these varied experiences? And he points to this interplay of initial conditions, underlying economic structures, structural change, and the way that structural change happens in an economy, and persistent gender norms and values. So it is this interplay that we're going to try and kind of break down today and make sense of it for our region. And our region stands out if you look at the work. If you look at the world at large, look at labor force participation as one basic metric of what's happening in the labor market, you will see that there's always a gender gap. But you'll see the two regions that stand out are the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia. The other thing to observe is male labor force participation has been declining a bit over time. So if the gaps are closing, it's not because women are participating more, it's because male labor force participation is falling across all regions. And then also that for the past 20 years, if you look at MENA and South Asia, it's pretty consistently wide. You don't see too much of a narrowing of the gap like you might see in Latin America. Let's expand the view a little bit to say we start with labor force participation, but let's look at a broader set of metrics in labor market outcomes. And this is the kind of work that we're hoping to undertake as part of this project to do a much more sort of systematic stock taking of just descriptive patterns when it comes to labor market indicators. So aside from labor force participation, let's look at educational attainment, unpaid work, even among those employed, which is a metric that is collected, and a relevant one, total hours worked, excluding the work that we don't count as work, which is what we do every day to take care of ourselves and others, and wages. And this is data that some of our team members, one of them is here, Akash, have worked to try to compile from the World Bank's Global Jobs Indicators database, the joint database, and they have about 100 kind of harmonized indicators relevant to labor market and economic outcomes. So what you'll see here are basically differences in female versus male indicators. So just pure differences, this is not a ratio. And that's the gap that you will see across these graphs. These are all very preliminary, so very happy to get your input, to refine them, revise them as we continue to move this project forward. So one of the most sort of consistent things Claassen, everybody has pointed out, is that education has transformed. You have small gaps when it comes to education. And those gaps have sort of stayed the same over the past 2 decades or so, right? So you'll see different points, you see the different regions in different colors, but in general, you see low gender gaps in tertiary education. So then the puzzle is, so what happens after this education, right? What are women who have almost closed the gap doing with our education? Labor force participation looks a lot more gappy. You see much wider or larger gaps. And if you look across the regions, there are some very interesting patterns. You will see that in India, there seems to be somewhat of a stasis or a decline, so the gaps are kind of there or growing. And whereas in some place like Bangladesh, again, somewhat large gap persists in terms of who is participating in the economy. A place like Pakistan, from a very, very large gap, you have some measure sort of moving towards slightly smaller gaps, but a place like Nepal stands out with very low gender gaps in participation in the labor force. So that's one metric of looking at what is happening with the labor market. Unpaid work. Countries like Bangladesh and Nepal seem to have a very sharp decline in those reporting gender gaps in unpaid work. Here you'll see, obviously, women are doing much more unpaid work than men, therefore it's a positive difference. But you will see that that is declining heavily in some countries, but not in other countries, for example, India or Sri Lanka. Hours worked. You would expect that, as there is growth, there would be an increase. If I'm more educated, I would spend more time. We all know the constraints, which we'll get into today, but I would spend more time sort of working in the market. But you will see that pattern again, lots of variability across the countries. And the one where you see it the most distinctly in terms of shrinking of gender gaps or sort of women working as much as men is in Bangladesh, versus the other countries in the region. And similarly, again, in hourly wages, there's some indication of gender wage gaps shrinking with growth. Again, Bangladesh seems to be leading on this front. But there are also, relative to the other gaps that we've discussed, the wage gaps, at least at present, seem to be somewhat smaller to begin with. So one thing to keep in mind as we just go through thinking about what does this mean? What could some of these patterns, what are they reflecting? Klassen points out specifically, to some of the structural transformation processes, like those in Bangladesh, which has taken a very distinctly export-oriented manufacturing route, which has brought a lot of educated women into the non-white-collar services domain to earn good remunerated income. So that is, again, something useful to keep in mind as we're looking at these gaps. What is going on with structural transformation and economic growth processes, and what is going on with societal and economic structures to begin with. Brief mention, heterogeneity within India. On the extremes, states and union territories, very poor, very rich, you see a reasonable amount of gender gap. So this is, again, something that doesn't fit the pattern to say, that gender gaps will disappear with high incomes. And urbanization as well is not a very good predictor of small gender gaps in India. On the extreme right, you have high urbanization, and you also have a large spread in terms of gender gaps. So our project is basically to explore these dynamics in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but also more globally, to think about what happens when there are these processes of economic transformation, structural change, who is benefiting, who is participating, why not? How much is it a reflection of preferences? How much is it a reflection of constraints and structures? How does it interact with all of the behavioral dynamics that we study so well in microeconomics? How do we marry these to create a picture of really what is going on and what can be improved? There are two focal questions, and I'll sort of wrap up with these. So the way we're approaching this kind of stock-taking exercise is thinking about two questions. A, does economic growth in and of itself close gender gaps? Is there evidence for this? How does this work? And the second is, if there are persistent gender gaps in labor market outcomes in particular, does that affect growth? Does that cause any complications in how our economies can grow, given that we are in a region with significantly large gender gaps? So on the first question, there's good evidence that some gender gaps systematically shrink, education, healthcare outcomes. Also, certain outcomes that are more relevant for women, like fertility, also systematically shift with economic growth. But the same processes do not seem systematically to close other gender gaps, like labor market outcome gaps. So there are two ways to think about this that we've started to explore. One is, maybe these gaps are efficient in some way, and it'll be good to unpack what does that mean if growth is about improved productivity. So there is some literature around a biological basis for particular kinds of tasks and skills. There's a literature on, everybody knows the plow-based, agriculture versus non, the differences in gendered employment outcomes there. There's also fine motor skills or not. So tea, coffee, again, regions where there's, so again, I would love to hear feedback, on some of these points as well, but this is from the literature. There's also a literature on women having less of a disadvantage when it comes to brain-based occupations versus brawn-based. So that's Michelle Rendell's work. So that's one set of explanations that we're trying to dig into to say, okay, what is going on in terms of fit as opportunities change? But the second is thinking about why these gaps persist, even if they might be completely inefficient, right? Not good for productivity. So the culture, there's Nathan Nunn's work on learning being hard and slow, and that's why we take so many shortcuts in proxies, that learning is hard and slow, and therefore some of these inefficiencies will persist, even because they require a certain amount of learning to make these changes. And then there's Rohini's work as well, thinking more historically about what are the political dynamics of shifting opportunities and shifting rewards. And so this was a paper from academia in the 19th century. So is there a reason that you would maintain separate spheres by gender because there are there is some rent-seeking opportunity that persists? To the second question, does the existence of gender gaps curtail growth? There's some sort of more historic analysis. I'm just citing a few papers and references so that you have something in mind as you go into the day. There's work on the computing industry in the UK and how there was a concerted effort to basically reinforce the breadwinner norm among males in the UK after World War II, which this analysis concludes was to the detriment of the UK's computing industry, because the early computing engineers of sorts, however you would call them, were women, both in the US and the UK. There's a seminal paper by Shi et al., which is surprisingly recent in terms of the analysis that we should have been doing this many decades ago, but thinking about talent allocation when you have a shift in who is providing that talent. So they analyzed the US healthcare industry from the 1960 to 2010 period, a 50-year period, and they find that with the advent of women and black professionals into the US healthcare industry in the role of doctors, et cetera, over this period, you have a 20 to 40% increase in productivity of the sector. So this is a clear gain to be had if you have people who are more suited to the task doing the task. There's also more recent work. Ashraf et al. Use data from a large multinational company to discuss or to find how female employees, at least in this instance, are more productive than their male counterparts. And then you'll hear from Gaurav later today in terms of his work with Penny, which discusses some of the dynamics in entrepreneurship in thinking about productivity and gender dynamics. So for the day, here are some takeaway points that would be perhaps helpful to keep in mind as we dig into some of these in more detail. So growth processes obviously influence how gender gaps in labor markets evolve. Persistent gender gaps can also evolve, how growth can also affect how growth processes evolve. There isn't a sort of simple, pat way to think about this relationship. Structural transformation processes and the resulting demand or opportunities for women's labor, they are critical, and you'll hear about this in the first session, which is all about labor demand. This influences how gender gaps evolve. At the same time, the institutional environment, the informal institutional normative environment, political economy dynamics, learning processes, and their costs all simultaneously also shape individual and household decision-making around labor supply. So this is our plan for today. This is meant to be a conversation. It's meant for us to learn from you and try to ask these questions a bit better in this project. But our goal here is very much to both address women's preferences and ideas and talents, but also make sure that the needs of policymakers who are trying to, and industry experts who are trying to make decisions on how to push our countries forward, have the right set of evidence to make these kinds of decisions. Thank you. So I think maybe we can do one or two questions, and then we'll have a wonderful panel ahead, if there are.
Question, if you raise your hand, there's some the microphone.
Wonderful. So then we'll just, we have one. Go ahead, please.
It's not nice to have no questions, so I thought I will volunteer. But it may be a stupid question. Can you show your slide 10 and 11?
Yes.
I usually am curious to ask about the outliers in the slides. So I want to know, while you have shown that the trend is that there's huge gaps, but in the same slides there are also outliers who are above zero. And if you could name or tell them why, are they just outliers? Are they doing something different which we could learn from? Because policymakers don't like to listen failure stories, and they don't want to learn from it. Although academics, we explain why things fail. They want to know who is doing well and tell me what's the secret and can I replicate it? And this goes well, actually. So I thought this could be also part of the conversation today. So I hope this question can be considered. Thank you.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Sita Ram. I work with Professor Tetsushi Sonobe at the Asian Development Bank Institute. Thank you.
That is a wonderful point, and I learned this as well from my time at the Gates Foundation, that this question of exemplars is very motivating, which is not the way kind of quantitative analysis works, but is extremely informative, in thinking about what are the policy tools available. So in this is basically multiple points in time per country for when labor market statistics were generated, and so that's what we're displaying here. So each country has about 4 or 5, you'd see, data points, or actually a few more, over the course of a 20-year period. The outlier here clearly seems to be there's something happening in one instance with the Maldives, which I would not take too seriously. But this is also very preliminary. So for example, we could very easily cut out outliers which don't make sense. And I think we've started to do that process, but not, we haven't finished this analysis. So that would be one way to say that there's something aberrant either in the data. So, but absolutely true that we should pay attention to it. Because but I think that's something that's happening with the Maldives. In terms of other regions, I think there's a lot that we could explore. In the interest of time today, we focused a bit on South Asia, but there's a lot of interesting information on the same patterns in other regions, Latin America being a really good one, to see what has happened, to labor market dynamics over time. East Asia being another really interesting comparator for South Asia, but it's not obvious, the way growth and gender gaps have evolved. So totally point taken that we will pay attention to outliers and exemplars. I'm hoping the session this afternoon on policy tools, which Rolly will lead, will have some of that reflection on who is doing it well, and maybe part of the panel discussion as well. I hope that's a useful start. Yeah. Great. And Yamini, you had one more point? Oh. Yes.
Thank you for this very wonderful presentations. I think you have really brought forward the clear picture of how South Asia looks like when it comes to gender gap. But however, I think even within India, if you look at it, if you look at Northeast, or like if you look at UP, Bihar, and if you look at South, I think there is very different dynamics, particularly from the gender norms. If you look at Pakistan, growth alone is not the drivers of closing gender gap. Behind I think, growth and economic prosperity, there is gender norms that is there, very much ingrained, particularly in South Asia. I think that's something I think we didn't see in your presentations, and if you have something, that would be very nice.
Absolutely. So this is just our very high-level framing for the day, but the second session today, which is in the afternoon, right after lunch, is all about labor supply-side dynamics. So that is going to delve into these questions of norms, values, learning, bargaining, decision-making, and the measurement of all of these things for us to understand how are these decisions around labor supply made. And that varies very widely across both, states and regions within India, but also within the region at large. So that's absolutely on our list, and you'll see even here in this graph, there is nothing immediate that happens with growth, right? Because you have states which are very rich, Chandigarh, Delhi, Gujarat, Haryana, on the extreme right, which are rich, but which have very large gaps in terms of labor market participation. And in India, generally urban labor market participation, which you would think maybe, the gaps will be smaller, it's not the case. In fact, I think it's been at a very low, under rural gender gaps for a long time. It's been very low, 15% or something, 15 to 20% is India's urban. So there's a lot to unpack on labor supply, and I think we'll dive into that this afternoon. And also in the first session today, have a little bit of a discussion on what is going on between the demand for labor and the supply for labor, and the measurement questions around that. Great.
Thank you.
Yes.
slide in one quick comment, actually dovetailing off of the previous one, which is this whole question of the relationship between fertility and economic growth and employment or economic participation, right? I think the directionality in your graph was a bit, or at least in your narrative, was a bit linear.
Yes.
And we know that that's way more complex, and in some ways it's not really established what leads to what. So again, as you said, looking forward to unpacking that, because I think for India and this region, especially talking about the demographic dividend, this question of education, transition to labor markets, marriage markets, all become super critical. So just wanted to make that comment.
Absolutely right. I think we didn't spend very much time at all on that, but I'm hoping we'll have a robust discussion around, marriage, labor, fertility, birth of first child today. Great. Thank you all for those wonderful questions, and I'll pass it to Satya.